you. This is declared by the Lord. God is on our side. He is with you. Even if you don't feel it, He is always with you. During every moment of your life, from the very best to the very worst, God is with you. He cares for you. You will never walk through something hard alone. He comforts you during hardship, encourages you amidst difficulty, and strengthens you in the time of weakness. He is with you right now. He has been with you all along. You are not alone. So, children, be assured that God is always with you. A very, very blessed day to each one of you, my dear children. So, are you ready for the class? Shall I start the class? Yes, I think you're all ready. You have your textbooks with you right now. So you can open your textbooks to page number 45. So I'll be explaining about the equilibrium between ADF and ASF. What is ADF? Aggregate demand function. What is ASF? Aggregate supply function. So already we have seen what is ADF and what is ASF. Now we are going to see the equilibrium between ADF and ASF. So this is found on page number 45, 3.6.3. Okay. So under the Keynes theory of employment, a simple two-sector economy consisting of household and the business sector is taken to understand the equilibrium between ADF and ASF. So Keynes explains this concept through a simple two-sector economy. So what is a two-sector economy? It consists of the household sector and the business sector. So to understand the equilibrium, Keynes has taken a simple two-sector economy consisting of the household sector and the firm or the business sector. Okay. So all the decisions concerning the consumption expenditure is taken by the household. So in our houses, we only make all the decisions. So the households take the decision concerning the consumption expenditure. So what all expenditure we have to do at home, only we decide. Nobody decides it for us. Okay. The consumption expenditure at my home is decided by me and my family. Nobody else comes and decides it, or nobody takes the decision in my house. So the households take the decision concerning consumption expenditure. Similarly, the firms take the decisions concerning investment. So all the decisions concerned with the investment is taken up by the firms. Okay, here they have given two assumptions. The first one is consumption is linear. Consumption is linear. What do you mean by the term linear? If the consumption function is linear, the MPC remains constant. MPC means the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume remains constant, but the average propensity to consume varies. Okay, I'll explain again. What do you mean by consumption is linear? If the consumption function is linear, the marginal propensity to consume will be constant, but the average propensity to consume varies. We will be learning about the marginal propensity to consume and the average propensity to consume in the next chapter. But before that, while taking this itself, I just want to give a brief introduction about this. Consumption is linear. It is not there in your textbook. Okay. You won't find this in your textbook. This is just for you to understand it better. What do you mean by linear? Uh, See this tabular column, okay? Income is given, income of an individual, okay? Is first it's 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, like that. So based on that, he is consuming. So the consumer consumption is, when it is 1,000 rupees, the consumption is 950. 1,100, the consumption is 1,020. When it is 1,200, the consumption is 1,090, and it goes on. So how do you find out the average propensity to consume, that is APC? In the previous slide, I told you, explain what is APC and MPC. So what is APC? APC is calculated by the formula C by Y, C by Y. So what is your C? Consumption is 950, and what is your income? 1,000. So it is 950 divided by 1,000, that is 0.950. Are you able to understand? So next, income is 1,100 and consumption is 1,020. So how do you calculate APC? C by Y. So 1,020 divided by 1,100, that gives me 0.927. So similarly, I calculate. So how do you calculate the APC? APC is calculated by dividing consumption by income. Consumption by income. How do you calculate marginal propensity to consume? There is a formula for that. Delta C by delta Y. What is delta? Delta means change in consumption. Delta means change in consumption divided by change in income. C and Y is different. Here I say delta C. Delta C means it is change in consumption divided by change in income. So how do I find out this change in consumption? You take this first one, okay? Here it is 950 and here it is 1,020. So my income has increased. How much has it increased? It has increased by 70. Okay. It has increased by 70 crores because it is given in crore. So it has increased by 70 crores. So the change in income is 70. Okay. Now change in income is, change in consumption is 70. How much is the change in income? First it was 1,000. Now it is 1,100. So how much is the change? 100. So 70 by 100 is equal to 0.70. Similarly, the next line, marginal propensity to consume. How do you calculate? Delta C by delta Y. Now see the difference between these two, 1,090 and 1,020, 70. Similarly, 1,200 minus 1,100, 100. So change is equal to 70 by 100 is equal to 0.70. So when you calculate here, you notice that the marginal propensity to consume is the same, 0.70, 0.70, 0.70, 0.70. So the marginal propensity is constant and the average propensity to consume varies. So if it is a linear consumption function, you have to understand that the marginal propensity to consume will be constant and the average propensity to consume will vary. Okay, that is what is given in the assumption. Consumption is linear. So what do you mean by linear? If the marginal propensity to consume is constant and the average propensity varies, then the function is said to be linear. Okay, this is how you calculate APC and MPC. You will be learning about this in the fourth chapter also. Okay, what do you mean by non-linear? Non-linear is not given there, but I just want to explain it so that you will have an additional knowledge about linear consumption and non-linear consumption. Okay, what is non-linear consumption? Now look at this column, okay? Income is given and consumption is given. How do you calculate average propensity to consume? C by Y. So 950 divided by 1,000 gives me 0.950. Similarly, 1,040 divided by 1,100 will give me this. So this is how I calculate my average propensity to consume. How do I calculate the marginal propensity to consume? It is delta C by delta Y. Delta C means change in consumption divided by change in income. Okay. So how do I calculate marginal propensity to consume? Change in income. So change in consumption. So 1040 minus 950 will give me 90, divided by the change 1100 divided by 1000 will give me 100. So it is 0.9. Were you able to understand? So here, if you notice, the marginal propensity is not constant as in this case. The marginal propensity to consume varies: 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, 0.5. And as usual, average propensity also varies. So here, the marginal propensity to consume varies and the marginal propensity to consume also varies. So this is called as non-linear consumption function. If it is linear, marginal propensity will be constant and the average propensity to consume will vary. Did you understand? So let us go back to the equilibrium between ADF and ASF. So just to make you understand this particular line, I had that additional slide. So here consumption is linear. Similarly, investment is autonomous. What do you mean by investment is autonomous? Investment can be induced or investment can also be autonomous. So investment can be induced or autonomous. What do you mean by autonomous? Okay, if actually investment is dependent on two things. One is output and the other one is rate of interest. So investment is governed by the output or the rate of interest. What do you mean by that? Suppose if I'm investing in a particular business and if my output is large or if my output is more, I tend to invest more and more because I invest little amount but my output is more. So it is very profitable. So as an entrepreneur, I will be looking only at the profit. So what happens? I invest less but my output is more. So I tend to invest more because my output is more. The other factor for investment is rate of interest. Suppose I am borrowing money. If the rate of interest is high, I will borrow less and my investment will be less. If the rate of interest is low, I will tend to borrow more and invest more. So investment is dependent on two things. One is output and the other one is rate of interest. Okay. But here you say autonomous. What do you mean by autonomous? That means my investment is not dependent on both output and rate of interest. My இன்வெஸ்ட்மெண்ட் வந்து ரெண்டு இதை பொறுத்து இருக்கும்னு சொல்றேன். ஒன்று ரேட் ஆஃப் இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட், ஒன்று வந்து அவுட்புட். ஆனால் அட்டானமஸ் நீங்க சொல்லும் போது என்ன சொல்ல வரேன்னா, என்னுடைய இன்வெஸ்ட்மெண்ட் வந்து தன்னிச்சையா செயல்படுது. அதாவது என்னுடைய இன்வெஸ்ட்மெண்ட் வந்து அவுட்புட்டை பொறுத்தும் இல்லை, rate of interest பொறுத்து இல்லை. So these two are assumptions. Consumption is linear and investment is autonomous. So were you able to understand, my dear children? Okay, so equilibrium between ADF and ASF. There are two approaches for that. One is the aggregate demand approach and the other one is called as the the first one is aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach and the other one is saving investment approach. So to determine the equilibrium between ADF and ASF, there are two approaches. One is aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach and the other one is saving investment approach. I think I am clear up to this point. So first I said what is equilibrium, how to find out equilibrium between ADF and ASF. So we have taken a two-sector economy, the household and the business. The household takes decision concerning investment, consumption expenditure, and all the firms take the decision concerning investment. Consumption is linear and investment is autonomous. This you will be writing in the first paragraph. Second one, there are two approaches. One is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach and the savings investment approach. But here in our textbook, it has been made very easy for you, but as they have given only one approach, we will be studying only the aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach. So here equilibrium is determined through the aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. Okay, So equilibrium between ADF and ASF. So what approach is this? Aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach. Equilibrium can be found out by using two methods. One method is aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach, and the other one is saving investment approach. So we are going to use only one approach, that is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach. Okay. So look at this graph. Okay. See, you can see this graph. On the x-axis, you have the employment, and on the y-axis you have the ADF and the ASF, or you can also say the proceeds and the cost. The proceeds and the cost, what all revenue you get and what all cost you make. So on the x-axis we have the employment, and on the y-axis you have ADF and ASF. Okay, so look at this diagram. On the employment you have two markings here, N1, N0 and NF. N1, N0 and NF. And this yellow color curve is called as the AD, aggregate demand curve, and this green color is called as the ASF curve, or the aggregate supply curve. Okay, yellow is aggregate demand curve and the green one is aggregate supply curve. So the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply meet at a point called E. Can you see this point? Okay, aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve meet at a point called E. This point is called as equilibrium. That means aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, or you can also say it as effective demand. This point is equilibrium. Equilibrium is a place where the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve cut each other or intersect. So this is the point of equilibrium. So from equilibrium, I draw a straight line, okay, perpendicular to the x-axis. Okay, from here I draw a straight line which is perpendicular to the x-axis. This is called as N0. What is this called as? N0. Okay, so this is a point of equilibrium. Now come to this point. Okay, suppose if the employment is ON1, ON0 is the point of equilibrium. Now come to ON1. Here you have to see two things, the green color curve and the yellow color curve. So the N1, at N1, ON1 level of employment, I repeat, at ON1 level of employment, at ON1 employment, the aggregate supply is N1R1. The aggregate supply is N1R1. Okay, the aggregate supply is N1R1, but they are able to produce N1M1, but they are able to produce N1M1. At ON1 employment, the aggregate supply is N1R1, but they are able to produce N1M1. So this is called as the profit. This is called as the profit. Are you able to understand, girls? At ON1 level of employment, the supply is N1R1, but they can produce up to N1M1. So what is the profit? The profit that they make is, the entrepreneur makes is M1R1. The profit made by the entrepreneur is M1R1. So this is called as the expected level of profit. M1R1 is the expected level of profit. Okay. So what does the entrepreneur do? He keeps on employing more and more number of people. Okay. The main aim of the entrepreneur is to make profit. So to make profit, his output has to increase. So to increase his output, what does he do? He keeps on employing more and more number of laborers. So the entrepreneur will be employing more laborer, more laborer, more laborer. So here he is making profit. So he will tend to employ more and more and more and more and more number of people till he reaches N naught. எது வரைக்கும் ஆட்களை சேர்த்துட்டே இருப்பாரு லேபரஸ? ஓல இருந்து இந்த இடம் பூரா எது வரைக்கும் N நாட் வரைக்கும் நிறைய பேரை எம்ப்ளாய் பண்ணிட்டே இருப்பாரு. ஏன்னா எம்ப்ளாய் பண்ண அவருக்கு ப்ராஃபிட் வந்துட்டே இருக்கும். ஸோ டில் திஸ் பாயிண்ட் he will be employing the laborers. இந்த லெவல் வரும்போது he attains equilibrium. At point E, the employment level is N naught. That is, the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply are equal. This is the point where the aggregate demand and aggregate supply will be equal. In the beyond this point, if you see, the green line, the green curve goes up and the aggregate demand is beneath the AS curve. The aggregate demand curve is below the AS curve. That means after this point, the entrepreneur will start making a loss. Till this point, he will be making profit because here the supply is more, but the demand is less. So he will be making a loss here. So no entrepreneur will be functioning to make a loss. He will like to make only profit. So he will stop employing the laborers at this point, at the point of E. So beyond N naught, he will not employ anyone. Are you able to understand? But NF level is a point of full employment. NF is the point of full employment. But he is employing only how many people? Till N naught only the entrepreneur is employing. But how many people are available? Till NF people are available. But he wants only N naught number of people. So this small gap is the area of unemployment. This area is unemployment because there are NF number of people available, but the entrepreneur wants only N naught number of people. So this small gap is the level of unemployment. Okay, so did you understand? So at point E, the employment level is N naught. It is not no, it is N naught. That is, aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal. The tendency to employ more labor will stop once they reach the point E. So up to this point E, the entrepreneur will be employing people. But beyond this, okay, the tendency to employ more labor will stop once they reach point E. After this point E, he will not employ anyone. Beyond N naught, the aggregate demand curve is below the aggregate supply curve. Okay, beyond, this is N naught, girls. Okay, so beyond N naught, O N naught, that is beyond O N naught, the aggregate demand curve is below the aggregate supply curve. This is aggregate supply and this is aggregate demand. So the yellow curve is below the AS curve, indicating loss to the producer or the entrepreneur. So they will never employ more laborers after this point E. The difference between N naught and NF is the level of unemployment. So the difference between these 2 points is the level of unemployment. One thing you have to remember here is, it is important to note that the equilibrium level of employment need not be full employment. This is only equilibrium level of employment, but this is only full employment. So one thing you have to notice, at equilibrium, it may not be the full employment always. So it is important to note that the equilibrium level of employment need not be full employment. So equilibrium level la kandipa full employment irukkonunu avasiyam illa. So this can be clearly understood because equilibrium is attained as N naught, but the level of full employment is at NF. So you have to understand that the equilibrium level of employment need not be full employment. Okay, so this effective demand, the concept of effective demand becomes significant in explaining underemployment. Okay, so this concept of effective demand only becomes significant in explaining the underemployment equilibrium. Hope you understood this, girls, the equilibrium between ADF and ASF.